Hey, everybody. I'm here for the second time. I'm delighted to be here for the second time with Frederic Lowen. Let me just read you Frederic's bio. And if you're interested, we also have another video that we did that's up on my Facebook pages and also on my In Realman channel on YouTube that you can check out. Frederic Lowen, son of Alexander Lowen, MD, psychotherapist and bioenergetic therapist, executive director of the Alexander Lowen Foundation, manager of Lowen Copyrights, with extensive experience in bioenergetics, bioenergetic therapy, workshop and training groups since 1968. Frederic seeks to expand the visibility, appreciation, and use of bioenergetics for health and well-being. You can connect with him and his work at lowenfoundation.org. And just to say, I worked with his dad for a period of time at the house in Connecticut in the late 90s, and have written a lot about bioenergetics. And I think all three of my books, my longer books, including Grounded Spirituality. And I carry the bias, which I freely and comfortably acknowledge, that I believe that, for me at least, bioenergetic therapy was a true spiritual practice. It helped me to understand that this thing called spirituality was the way in which I experienced it as an embodied process, experiencing unity consciousness at the tail end of strong cathartic emotional releases, for example. It showed me a different understanding of spirituality than the more bifurcated and dissociated spiritual bypass-oriented version that I was confronted with culturally. And I still very much believe that deep working somatic psychotherapists are the true spiritual practitioners. We were going to talk about a theme that's been very active in my consciousness now for a long period of time, which is this thing called abuse of power. Abuse of political power, abuse of spiritual power, material power, and really just trying to understand the psychological structure of somebody who longs for power and who has a tendency to abuse power. And maybe I sort of think about it in terms of my own experience, stages in my life where I longed for something called power, you know, as a child or in my 20s, and usually at disempowered stages. But my experience was that the more developed my egoic structure was, the more I accomplished things, the more that I felt as though I could set out to do something and I could find my way to actualize it. I felt as though I shifted from a more unhealthily egoic structure that was fragmented or overcompensatory to a more integrated sense of self. And then I found I got kind of done with the self. I felt like not that you're ever fully done with the self, but I didn't feel obsessively focused on self-development. I started to find my attention was moving in the direction of trying to be of service and bring an offering out to the world. And my way of understanding people who long for power, as opposed to longing to do service, are psychologically still at a fragmented stage or an underdeveloped stage egoically, where they're trying to fill some hole inside of the ego that can never in fact be filled that way. And I think it matters because I think the state and stage you're at within the self really informs the kind of experience you're going to have and bring to the world if you ever do gain power politically, spiritually, religiously, or materially. So having worked with people for so long, how do you see the psychological state of the one who clamors for power and is more inclined to abuse it than not? Like, what's going on in there? What's going on in there?
Yeah. Well, first, let me thank you for your invitation and your introduction. It's always a pleasure to speak together.
Yeah.
In a word, psychopathy.
In a word.
In a word, psychopathy.
Okay.
I think when you link the need for power and the abuse of power, it's always got a psychopathic element to it, in my view. And like all psychological disorder, of which psychopathy is one, it's really a function of fear. You know, fear, in my mind, is really behind all psychological disorder, and especially so behind psychopathy. Typically, and I think of Trump, but of course Putin is another excellent example of, you know, psychopathy and leaders who exhibit that. In the case of Trump, we know quite a bit about his background. And I would say that, you know, he was raised in a way that he wasn't accepted as a child, except for what he could achieve. And his father, I think, as most people know, was a successful business person, and gave his son the idea that he would only accept little Don, Trump, if he exhibited that ability to make things happen at any cost. And I think what drove him in this case to that need for power was actually seeking connection with his father, you know, connection and acceptance. And the disorder aspect of it is that it represents an illusion. The illusion that if he can achieve this stuff, if he can act like his father expects him to act, that he's going to gain that connection, support, and love that he should have gotten as a child, you know, except for his father's own issues and inability to really be a father guiding his son. You know?
Right. And that's why I used to say, when I thought about Trump, is this guy's got a hole in his ego so big that not even the presidency can fill it. I mean, most people would reach the stage where they become the president and they're kind of healthily self-satisfied, like they've actually come, you know, the pinnacle of achievement, whatever that is. But in his desperate reactivity, his responses to various slights were being called out on his dishonorable behavior. It was very evident that, and the constant need to overcompensate, that it didn't work. You know, he didn't, it was an illusion. He didn't gain his father's love. He didn't reach a stage with validation that now he had a healthily developed ego, knew that he could bring his energy to the world and affect change, and now perhaps even became more humble, which often happens to people. You know, Ram Dass said you have to become something before you become nothing. This guy's never satisfied with the something he becomes. So I guess that's what you mean. That's the illusion, right?
That is the illusion, you know, that relentless pursuit of more and more power and wealth is going to somehow satisfy that ego, you know, and it just never does. And that's why it's so common for these very wealthy people to not stop. They can't stop, you know. They, no matter how much they have, they need more.
It's almost like the kudos that they do get. They can keep riding on the fumes of the kudos, so they don't have to settle back into what really little Donald feels like inside of himself, which is like some undervalidated, unloved, unworthy child. So just keep going for the next level of kudos, and then you can stay far removed from how you actually really feel about yourself deep down inside.
Well, there's a disconnect between the feeling and the kudos, because the kudos that you speak of are what I consider to be ego pleasure, not real feeling pleasure, not a bodily pleasure. okay, which they're not connected to. Trump is not a happy man.
That's obvious. Yeah.
That's obvious, you know.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, he's reached the peak of power, I'm sure, beyond his own imaginings, you know, and yet, like you say, he can't settle into it. Another hallmark, I think, of psychopathy and leadership is the degree of fear that surrounds the whole office. You know, obviously, people like Putin and Trump, you know, manage their affairs with fear. You know, they manipulate people, they manipulate circumstances, and it's always a matter of stimulating and provoking fear to get what they want.
And distracting everybody on so many different levels.
It's certainly distraction is another mechanism, but I think the fear is really the extremely dysfunctional aspect, you know, but it also is a necessary part of the psychopathy, because the psychopathy is created out of fear.
So take me into this experience. So if I imagine myself, this is hard to imagine, but if I imagine myself inside of a Trumpian consciousness, before I make the decision to run for federal office, and I have a choice, and let's say I'm aware I have a choice. So I'm a little healthier than Donald, let's say. And I have a choice between moving in the direction of another overcompensatory path, becoming the president and all of what that is for me. Or just some part of me says, you know, there's another direction that I could go where, in fact, maybe I won't even need this because I'll feel so deeply gratified in my own bones. Therapeutically, the guy walks in the room, a little healthier than Trump, but carrying a lot of the same patterns and tendencies. What do you do with him bioenergetically? What do we do with him to help him to reach the stage where he can feel deeply gratified simply being inside of his own body, without having to live an overcompensatory life?
Realistically, of course, somebody like Trump will never seek therapy. You know, it's like we were saying earlier before we got on, you know, what problem? I don't have a problem.
I don't have a problem.
Right?
You got the problem.
They're so disconnected that they don't recognize that. No. And the kudos that you mentioned before, the ego values, the ego pleasures, is what keeps them going. Just this feeling that they can, you know, force people to do their bidding, and they can scare people into whatever action, you know, suits Trump in this case, suits psychopath. But it is, like I say, it's an ego pleasure. It's like status. It's like somebody who gets a big raise all of a sudden. It's not really a bodily pleasure, you know, but it kind of makes you feel important, you know.
Got it.
And this ability to exercise power over people on the basis of fear, not on the basis of, you know, everybody aligned together, you know, like the Ukrainians. I mean, they are very admirable there. You know, they all pull together, and granted, they're responding to fear, but it's a real fear against being killed by these invaders, you know, these murderers, really. I mean, you know, almost to call the Ukrainian thing a war is to dignify it in a sense. It's really just mass murder on national scale. It's unbelievable. You know, none of us would have thought it wouldn't be possible in this 21st century. And I think, you know, you can see the insanity behind it. I mean, what is the purpose except to fulfill Putin's ego?
Yeah. And some kind of irrational, overwhelming fear that he carries within him on one level or another. I mean, that seems obvious to me.
That's right.
So systemically, so when I think about sort of something called democracy, I mean, I'm not sure democracy means anything if the people you're voting for aren't really showing you who they are when you're voting for them. So,
Right.
you get a vote, but you don't even know what you're getting, in fact, in this optics manipulated landscape. But
Yeah.
all the people that I know, for example, within Canada, who are, brilliant, highly intelligent, very stable, very healthily egoically developed. They don't think they're all that, but they know they have value and something to offer, have absolutely no interest in running for example, federal office. So, so the people who do, for the most part, I think, are overcompensating or filling a void or caught in some psychopathic trap, whatever that is. But I think it matters because I think our species is in trouble. Our impact on the environment is only the beginning of that conversation, but it's a very important thing to talk about. And I think a lot of it has to do with psychopathy at the helm. And the way that, in my view and in my experience, psychopathy at the center gets surrounded and protected by psychopathy, the middleman psychopathy, and all the rest of it, so that the system gets protected on all kinds of various levels of corruption. And I'm witnessing that in my own life in many ways right now. So what do we do? I mean, really tangible way before it's too late. And not to put this whole giant question entirely on you, Frederic. I know it's complicated. I mean, we're just having a talk, what do we do to craft a world where the only people who are really even allowed to run for federal office, for example, or to gain positions of power within law enforcement or judicial system or any of it, maybe are vetted on some very significant somatic psychotherapeutic level to find out who's really living inside of that ambitious organism.
Right. Well, I think you're on the right track. Unfortunately, it's not practically going to work, but I agree. It's crazy that, I think that we in the U.S. elected Trump to the most important job in the world, perhaps, while no American corporation would have ever hired him as a CEO.
Right.
So what's wrong with us in how we pick our leaders?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, if they're not intellectually, ethically, egoically, emotionally, or energetically qualified to run a lemonade stand, let alone a country, then how on earth did this happen?
Exactly. That's really at the crux of the question. And also you alluded to the reality that sane people won't put themselves through such a ridiculous, obstacle course to becoming president, but a psychopath will. And I think we have so many psychopaths in position of power is because they are all about power. Power is what they seek. And so it's no coincidence that at centers of power, guess who we find? Psychopaths. As true in government, as true in business as well.
They want it so bad. They just want it so bad, right?
Well, the power is, I think you can imagine that, as much as most healthy people seek connection and love, they actually seek power with the same kind of intensity. Right. Even more so, because I'm convinced that, they are so invested in their need to control, manipulate. And of course, they only see the world in terms of them being the center of the world.
Right.
So if it's not good for them, it has no interest to them. Okay. But they will manipulate their environment so that, they get everything in effect, one way or the other. And they're often the smartest people in the room because of that.
Whether the most strategic and savviest person in a certain way in the room, that's for sure.
Yeah, but with respect to their own interests, to make themselves up to be, the most important, the most capable person, Trump likes to say, I'm the only one who can do this. Right? You remember when he was president?
He is the only one who can eat Kentucky Fried Chicken, watch Fox News at 4 a.m, and tweet for an hour and a half at the same time. He is that man. He is that man.
Yes. Yeah.
He has a very, very unique skill set. But he's obvious to me. I mean, baby Donald.
Yeah, no,
I mean, where do you, I mean,
he's
it's like nothing you've ever seen before. You
right,
can't. It's like
right.
they assembled every fucked up thing in a human being and threw it in one guy. I worry a little bit more about the inobvious ones, and wonder, if there is a place. I feel like the veils are something's happened, and the pandemic, I think, has played a role in that, where people trapped in houses for 18 months, 24 months, start realizing that they have a lot of stuff that they're carrying that they were bypassing, but also they begin to look at the system and recognize this whole notion of the 1% is actually quite true. The way we're manipulated, controlled, overstimulated, and overwhelmed, so that we're not solid and centered enough to make conscious decisions, even as an electorate.
Yeah.
And I do think one of the things that's important is for people who have access to information about what's going on at the center, whether it's in politics or corporate environments or spiritual communities or religious communities, come out and share that information. Because oftentimes people have no clue what's going on in their busy lives outside of that. And I wonder, systemically, what it is that has to happen so that whistleblowers, legitimate, grounded, sensible, honest whistleblowers this may be the thing that will save us ultimately, is if there's enough of them to call out what's going on at the center and to feel supported culturally and collectively in the doing of that, so that we can reach the stage where the veils all fall away and we really understand exactly who's there, why they're there, and what they're really doing there. And Trump was obvious, and there were whistleblowers. So for some reason, I don't know what the reason is, he still was able to remain in power for 4 years, despite being called out repeatedly. So systemically, is the whistleblower path the path? Many people say don't ever bother to whistleblow. It's a waste of time. It'll never change anything systemically.
Well,
that's their pessimism. And maybe that's true. But then what?
But it's not just that bad, because, I'm sure that the whistleblowers are often treated worse than who they're blowing the whistle on.
Because of what starts to surround the center and the power of the center and all the rest of that.
Yeah, you can put it that way, but I think it's more fundamentally that people evade the truth.
Mm-hmm.
They evade the truth. I think there's a saying that says that a lie will circle the globe 3 times before truth gets out of bed and puts shoes on.
Well, very few people are living in truth in most parts of their lives. I mean, that's factual.
That's exactly right. People are inauthentic, and they don't mean to be, but that's how they were brought up. And it refers really to what I call the mind-body split, which I think also is fundamental to all psychological disorder. And, if people weren't split, they would be authentic in themselves.
They'd be integrated. There'd be an integrated whole, right?
Feelings would be integrated and aligned with the thinking.
Yeah.
But the mind-body split refers to a condition in which thinking does not inform feelings, and feelings don't inform thinking.
That's the culture. Right there.
That is the culture. All right. So we think one way that we should do this, but actually we feel a different way. And we're not even aware of that split.
I also wonder if, I think there's some truth to the idea that, I remember when Trump would keep acting out, as a Canadian, I kept thinking, for God's sakes, you're actually going to get rid of him yet. And it was almost as though, from a survivalist perspective, because many survivalists vote for him, he became more appealing because he could keep getting away with things without losing his office. And I think it made them feel safer with Big Daddy, like Big Daddy was really in charge, and Big Daddy really knew what he was doing, because nothing could remove Big Daddy from his position. And I mean, is there a way in which that we feel more protected, shielded, secured, safer when there's psychopathy at the helm?
Well, the abuse of power in these circumstances really is a two-way street. You know, one has to do like what we've talked about, the leader, but then it has to do with the support that they get from their followers, you know, the portion of the population. And surprisingly, you know, as off the wall as Trump is, and as much as he lies and is deceptive, you know, there must be 100 million Americans or more
Swear by him.
really believe that he's really the solution to our problems. Whereas I feel he's the essence of the problem itself, obviously. And I think the dynamic between a leader like Trump and the followers is basically that he appeals to their victimization. And in fact, you know, all these strong men hold themselves out as themselves being victims, but I am strong enough to overcome.
Right. Putin outlived the average Russian man by 20 years. So that's part of it. That's his story. You know, I was able to overcome. I was able to survive it. Yeah.
That's right. So, you know, if you are victims, let me be your champion, because I know how you feel. I'm a victim too, but I'm strong enough to overcome. And
and I care about you. So that's the part that's a little funny.
That's a lie. That's just a plain lie. You know, that's just a plain lie. But on the part of the followers, they typically were victimized as children. They're typically characterized as coming out of a authoritarian, even autocratic family, where fear was huge. You know, they had to comply with their parents' demands. And in a sense, even though many of them hated their parents, you know, which they may or may not admit publicly or even to themselves, you know, out of that environment, surprisingly, that's where they feel the safest.
Feels like home.
It feels like home.
Home is where the habit is.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's what was modeled to them. And then on top of that, there's some egoic overcompensatory thing also fueling the push to gain power, both happening at the same time. This is something I know well, and this is something I need desperately.
Well, that's where the fear is so important. In effect, the power is a compensation for the fear.
Got it.
You know?
Got it.
And that precludes a real healthy society built on pleasure.
Right.
Not just pleasure, but just the ability to enjoy life. You know, which in itself is so rare these days.
They certainly don't seem to be enjoying life. That's for sure.
Well, no, they're angry. I mean, you can see the anger and
constant acting out.
Yeah. And the surprising thing is, and I think it's something that we understand that many don't, but you know, why do particular groups vote in this example for Trump, even though Trump is actually, you know, coming up with policies that hurt them?
Yeah,
you know,
he doesn't seem to be their friend. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, they're over-identified with him for all kinds of different reasons. They feel like they get him, or he gets them, or there's some deep familial sameness, or some, you know, I think Big Daddy has a lot to do with it. He reminds a lot of them of the father who they had, who loved them, or who never did quite love them, but now finally is there to love them. I mean, there's so many, you know, there's 1,000 different reasons why people vote for somebody like that, that have something to do with their unresolved psychological history, you know.
Yeah. And generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that people don't actually see reality clearly. They see what they want to see.
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. They believe what they want to believe, and they're actually not capable of perceiving the reality all around them. In my opinion. And I think that that's an artifact of that mind-body split. When the mind is not connected to the feelings, then it's the same as not being connected to one's body. The feelings are the realm of the body. Thoughts and ideas are the realm of that non-material mind. But it's not through the mind that we engage with people and the world generally. It's through our body that we both perceive the world and engage the world in an active way. Now, if we're disconnected mind from body and thinking from feeling, then it really compromises our ability to even see the world clearly.
Yeah.
And so what happens, we go into our head and we think we see what we want to see, in effect, and we act that way accordingly. And I would describe that, or I would use that as a reason why we get so entrapped in these crazy ideologies. The ideologies, the political ideologies are so often, completely divorced from reality. And that's a function, in my opinion, of the ungrounded, disconnected mind.
I think the pace of the culture plays a big role in this too. And all of the, marketers and psychologists around political figures know about this, and certainly around corporations and marketers, all of that. If things are moving too quickly, you are much more easily victimized, quicker to be victimized by optics, by quick visuals, by catch-all phrases or something, because you don't have space or time in the way we're functioning day to day in this culture to nestle into your intuition, to re-embody yourself and connect to, like, I'm listening to this person. What do I really feel about this person? What do I really think about this person? It moves so damn quickly. So much of it is a manipulated structure that you're fed exactly what some psychologists realize human beings will respond to in their circumstances. And only when you get, and this certainly happened to me in my experience with the Trudeau situation, I just wasn't around it enough to really nestle into my intuitive body. And after a while, more information came in. I saw him come to Hamilton. I saw her at the house in Ottawa, Sophie Trudeau, and then I started to come back into my body and go, okay, what are you doing here? Do you belong here? Right. Does this feel really true to you? Is this a place that is integral for you? But without that information, relying on nothing more than pictures of a beautiful couple with beautiful hair and teeth and gorgeous children, it was very, very easy for me to project my belief that they were coming from the same place that I believed I was coming from. Right. And so you need more information and you need more time with that. Most people never get time around that. So it's easy to stay lodged in the belief without even knowing what the hell you're believing in.
And that's really that situation is not happenstance. That situation is constructed, in my opinion, just for the purpose of keeping population insecure.
Got it.
Insecure and disconnected from their feelings. Right? And I agree. The pace
and they're centered, not centered. I mean, I said in Soul Shaping, consumerism preys on the uncentered. Yes. Everybody in this culture is overwhelmed, overstimulated, and uncentered for the most part, except for people who completely opt out, and that's a whole other trip altogether. So how do you have an intuitive knowing if you're flooded, overwhelmed, overstimulated, and tired all the time? Exactly. You don't. And that's when they've all got you, right? That's when they've got you.
Yes, because buy my product and it'll make you feel better.
Well, then you feel like shit. So of course, and your self-concept is diminished, and you've been shamed in the family. I mean, this whole system benefits a very small percentage of power brokers who reap all kinds of economic and egoic benefits from our dissociation and bifurcation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And another point that I think is really important is that I would hypothesize, I do hypothesize that in the United States, as an example, my country, which is, you know, the most wealthy country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, that the population is much, much more motivated by fear and desire.
It feels true. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, to my knowledge, science cannot evaluate the truth or falsity of that statement. You know,
You just got to spend time in cultures, and then you know the veracity of that statement, though, right?
yeah, yeah, but it also takes, you know, it also takes a connection to your own feelings to really be able to see it, because one of the huge problems in therapy, and I think in the social order, is that people are motivated by fear, but they don't feel the fear. Okay, they deny the fear.
I see.
They deny their vulnerability.
They overcompensate, overpower, and perpetual positivity, the fear of something.
That's where the
even though their survivalist consciousness is the thing that's completely ruling their life in almost every regard.
Wait, say that again.
Survivalist consciousness. It's just everything's about avoiding some horrible outcome, whether it's poverty or, you know, so everything is, it is fear-based, but you're not showing the fear. You're moving into the marketplace with a completely different face on, but what's really motivating you to put the face on, to live in your adaptations, disguises, and defenses is fear of some outcome. Yeah, yeah. But we're worked in that place too. We're made to be far more frightened than we have to be. And I mean, so, you know, this tiny fragment of people knows how to keep us frightened so that we'll believe that they're the savior that's going to keep us away from the thing we fear most. I mean, it's a whole, I hate to feel this way, because I think my optimism, ironically, was ungrounded for a while with respect to how these systems are organized. I really believe that they're set up this way, or at least sustained with this intention, even if they had a good intention in the beginning, to keep us trapped in our anxiety and overwhelmed, so that a small number of people can live on a yacht, hang out in the Bahamas, and not have to worry about a bloody thing.
I think that's right. They have they operate more successfully in an environment of fear and anxiety than they do if everybody was really comfortable with themselves and their lives, you know, because again, the fear really stimulates that commercial activity.
Right, absolutely.
You know, we're driven much more to buy different products and different services out of varieties of fear. You know, obviously the pharmaceutical industry is entirely based on fear, as an example. But so isn't, you know, so isn't cosmetics and apparel. It's like, you know, if you're not up with the times, you're going to be left behind.
Yeah, so is the unconscious aspect of the media that keeps us frightened and terrified. So we're gripped to their news reports for fear that we'll miss out on some key piece of information of what's coming through the news cycle that will allow us to stay alive in this world. Right. Yeah, I mean, it's all about that.
And getting back to how fear is used by these psychopathic autocratic leaders, you know, they create this illusion that whatever, name your scapegoat, you know, could be Muslims or immigrants in our country and around the world. Immigrants are, you know, even though our policies have oftentimes created the necessity to move from wherever they're coming from, you know, we blame them for our own troubles. It's unbelievable.
Even though America was completely developed by immigrants. I mean, I don't even know where to start with this insanity.
No. Immigration is, you know, if anything, it adds vitality.
Yeah.
to our country. And, if we didn't have immigrants, we'd be the oldest country in the world. It's our immigration that keeps our average age demographically low. Europe is much older because they, in fact, have less immigration than we do.
And who's not an immigrant anyway?
And who's not really, anyways. But the idea that the immigrants are going to come in, somehow steal jobs and create a lot of crime, those are illusory fears that obviously work to the advantage of the leaders who put them out. And again, the button they're pushing is that victimization button. You're being victimized by these people.
Right. It's the Mexicans' fault that you don't have any money.
Exactly.
It's not the fact that you're a lazy ass trunk. It's the Mexicans' fault that you don't have any money.
That our policies have increased the cost of living so high that most people are totally stressed. But the cost of living in the United States is in itself a huge problem and issue that nobody talks about. They talk about the high cost of healthcare, perhaps, or that sort of thing, or whatever it is, high cost of gasoline now, although our gasoline is cheaper than any place else in the world. That's a whole story in itself. But why is it so expensive? I mean, you can't live comfortably in this country unless you earn about $70,000. That's over $1,000 a week. It's ridiculous that that you should earn that much money in the culture in order just to be comfortable,
in order to stay alive, even just to stay alive. I mean, I think in Toronto now, because of house prices have gone so crazy here, I think even 150 grand a year joint couples earnings is not enough to justify a mortgage for a Toronto house, but even with 20 to 25% down. So,
and I think it's worse in my country. I think
there you
it's
go.
worse in my country, and it's my own belief that, some substantial proportion of everything we pay goes directly to the billionaire's pocket. I shouldn't say directly, it's indirect, of course, but but a lot of the cost of doing everything, goes directly to people who really don't deserve it.
And who don't need it.
And who don't need it, except for the fact that it's their way of
egoically think they need it,
connection that they never got and never will get, by the way. So I think Trump's who was it who wrote the book about him? It was like his cousin, I think it was. And I can't remember the name of the book, except I think in the title, it's something the effect of, it's never enough. Never enough.
She was a Trump, wasn't she?
She was a Trump, yeah.
Mary, was it Mary Trump or something?
I think it was.
Just looking it up right now.
Yeah.
Oh, too much and never enough. Too much, never enough.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to recall exactly.
Oh, but it's got such a sweet picture of Donald on the cover, doesn't it? God, he didn't look like such a wreck back then. It was the seeds were just planting. Everything was gestating. Madness was just gestating.
No, he's
too much, never enough. Well, there you go. That's the mantra of the economically driven psychopath, right?
And that's based on an illusion. The reason for that being that they have an illusion that somehow they're going to get what they most deeply need by gaining that power.
The hole in the ego that can never be filled without actually dropping into your heart for the first time.
Exactly. So broadly speaking, I've been thinking about this a little bit too, in this crazy year. Democracy, how do they say it? Democracy is a terrible system, except it's better than anything else that we know of. something to that effect. But, you know, democracy is not enough. And
No,
it's not enough
it
because
doesn't mean enough that I get a vote if I don't know who I'm really voting for. If the options, there's no humane, authentic option, for example, if I'm picking the best of the worst options, which is often the case, certainly the case as people describe it in Canada. So what does that mean if we're not choosing amongst a web of options that are compelling, genuine, integrated, solid, and ready and willing and able to do service?
a lot of that problem is, again, and let me describe, you know, result of the mind-body split, because, you know, if you can't discern reality accurately, okay, then you fall for the image and you can't tell there's no substance there,
Mhm.
or that the substance is radically different than the image,
Mhm.
right? And of course, we're image driven.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's basically the mind-body split right there. I mean, you know, we just,
Yeah.
in our mind, we're so affected and influenced by image and ideas and thinking that, and at the same time, like you say, the whole culture is oriented to keep us from our feelings. They want to keep us in a state of anxiety
And
in,
overcompensation and all the rest
you
of
know,
that. Yeah.
because that's the matrix in which they can manipulate.
So it's interesting when I began sort of looking at traditional spiritualities and started to language patriarchal spirituality, New Age movement, New Cage movement, all that stuff. It was obvious to me, and I said, for me, Trump and Tolle are the same guy, because in both cases, I felt like these dissociated spiritualities and these dissociated capitalistic structures or ways of operating were always about preying on the uncentered and fragmented people. And that's where enrealment came to me. It was like, okay, so what does it mean to really be here? To really be in my body? And then it was like, okay, so presence for me is a whole being experience. I'm
Yes.
here for all of it. I'm not all fragmented and fractured. My parts are somewhat reasonably integrated. I can experience a sturdy and solid center. And from my sturdy and solid center, for the most part, except for me in the political world, I make the right decisions, move in the right directions. I honor my path. I move things out of the way that aren't honoring my path. I've learned enough to know what's a distraction and distortion. But I get it that these systems make a fortune off. We gravitate towards these systems, towards the unconscionable marketing structures, towards the dissociated spiritual and religious structures, because we're in a state of fragmentation and they somehow present themselves as the answer for us. And the real answer for us is emotional healing, acknowledging our trauma, clearing the emotional debris, coming back in, or maybe for the first time, into a state of whole being integration, enrealment, true presence, so that we're really here. And once we're really here, we're not as easily played.
Exactly.
And I get it that the faster the thing moves, the more they work us with these things. This
Yeah.
is a big part of this. I really believe that. I mean, when people are sitting at tables together and looking at their phones, some psychologist or some team figured out exactly what's going to distract human consciousness so that we spend our lives inside of these manipulated devices. And as a result, there's no experience of an integrated self. There's no two people at a table feeling one another anymore. They feel each other for a few seconds before they go back to the more important distraction device. So, Houston, we got a problem.
Yeah.
We got a real problem.
And it's not just that we don't feel each other, which we don't.
We don't feel
We don't
ourselves.
feel ourselves.
We don't even know we have feet, for God's sakes.
Many people don't even know they don't have feelings.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Even, you know, and I would like to pick up on your point of presence. You know, that's a benchmark I use in my therapy work. You know, I feel if a person has the capacity to fully be present, they don't need therapy. And that is a goal of therapy, by the way, at least the way I think of it. And it's interesting that most of my clients can't tell if they're present or not.
Yeah, what does it mean to be here? Just say to somebody, are you here? Just, it seems like the simplest and most complicated question. What does it mean for you to really be here?
Yeah.
right now. Because in my work, I couldn't get to the why are you here, until I got them here. So we got here.
Mhm.
But it is so difficult to get here because everything in the way it's set up is designed to keep us from being here so that we
Right.
look in the other direction to find our answers.
Right. The
So
other difficulty in achieving one's presence is the fear of their own feelings, just like what we started talking about.
mhm,
You know, that's what prevents people from being present.
mhm,
Because to be present, okay, you have to be good with all your feelings, even the painful ones.
right.
And that's why positivity is so limited in its ability to really help people feel good. You
Right.
know,
So it's
really,
only one thread of the weave,
it's
right?
only one side of it, and it's, denial of those painful feelings of hurt
Mhm,
and humiliation, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, all the fears, which, like I say, I think are much larger
mhm,
than desire
mhm.
and pleasure.
So it's almost as though the one who clamors for power the most is in fact actually the most frightened one of all. They're so frightened that the only thing that's going to give them an experience of not feeling momentarily frightened is to
Yeah,
feel so powerful and in control that
yeah.
nobody can hurt them any longer.
Yeah, I would say that their fear is huge. I
Mm,
wouldn't necessarily say they're the most frightened.
okay, got it.
I
Mm.
mean, strictly speaking, you know, the so-called schizoid and certainly
Yeah,
schizophrenic
yeah, 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 yeah,
live in terror. They live
yeah.
in terror.
They're more, yes, they're more immobilized energetically. Yes, right.
Yeah.
Got it, got it.
But a psychopath more deeply is in my opinion more fearful than the narcissist, for example,
Hmm,
or an oral character, and
hmm,
those fears can be huge as well.
hmm.
But I think I agree with you that psychopath is more fearful than they.
It would be interesting as a presence centering practice for all of us and anyone ends up listening to our conversation to sit and engage, watch politicians, pick a political figure, Trudeau, Trump, anybody, Putin, and just watch them. Just watch them for long enough that you can see them in psychological terms, not their presentation, not
Yeah,
the optics that they've worked,
yeah,
not any of that. Just
yeah.
that you see the abandoned child that is desperately in need of applause, or the rejected child who's desperately in need of approval, the failure child who's desperately needs to be presented as the one who's finally become a success after years of confusion on the career path, for example. And
Mhm.
if we can reach the stage where we can see a human, and we
Mhm.
don't have to hate the human, but just to try to see them and to get an intuitive sense of where they are at, it becomes a practice, an opportunity for us to actually come back into our bodies.
Generally speaking, I think, you know, most politicians are narcissists, and narcissists are huge on denial of any issue they might actually have.
Mm,
You know, until they reach a stage of emptiness is, I think, what causes a narcissist to seek therapy. And many never reach that. They live their lives fulfilling an image,
mm,
which is what narcissism is. Um,
right.
and like we were talking about before, what I was saying around distinguishing between image and substance,
Mm,
you know, they often look, and you say, you know, people say, oh, they look so handsome,
mm,
but it's the image. They've cultivated the image
mm.
at the expense of any real substance.
Yeah,
You know, I
yeah.
mean, and live substance, you know, they may have the substance of, you know, being brought up with all the morality of a church, for example, but that's a very rigid, which is a characteristic of narcissists. They live very rigidly, you
Mhm, mhm.
know, and to really reach, well, I shouldn't say to reach, but to see them as real people who are open to the reality of the situation, that you never see. Rarely, I shouldn't say never, of course, but you rarely see it amongst politicians of any sort.
They're tone deaf, right?
Well, again, they're trapped in their ideology. They're going to force reality. They're going to try to force reality to fit their ideology. Whereas, of course, you know, what they should do is develop policies, deal with reality as it is.
Yeah, enrealment. Absolutely.
You know?
I want to read a quote from Articulations, if I could, that I think kind of brings me back sometimes, because I've needed that the last little while. I'll just show the book cover. Your dad, I think, would agree with this. So we'll see what his son has to say. It's not all in your head. It's all in your heart. It's all in your feet. It's all in your hips. It's all in your shoulders. It's all in your breath. It's all in your body. Anything unattended to, unresolved, unhealed, and unprocessed lives in your tissues, your cells, your musculature. It may be manifest in your thinking, but it doesn't begin there. The mind does not source itself, the body does. The trick is to not try to shift your thinking from within the mind itself. You can't. You may be able to subdue it there, but you won't be able to resolve it, because the troubling thoughts are merely a symptom of the deeper issues. They're a reflection of our emotional holdings and constricted musculature. They emanate from the fleshy trauma tunnels that we dug in order to survive this world. Many of us sit in the waiting room of awakening for decades, waiting impatiently for our new birth. Yet it never arrives because we're looking for it where it isn't, within the mind itself or within the culture itself. Babies aren't born that way. You have to go down into the depths of the body to bring a new birth to life. Down, down, down into the alchemical chambers of new thought, your magnificent body. This is where we are born again. Close quote. This is where we're born again. So for all of this, if we don't come down here and ground into this body temple and work our way through whatever is obstructing our consciousness and our connection to it, we're ripe for the picking culturally, and we're at risk of all manner of psychological disorder as a result of being so disconnected from the body.
That's right. That's right. And again, I would say, and I do completely agree, and I think my father would too, with the sentiment in that quote. Yeah, and it really stimulates number of different aspects there. Energetically, I think, you know, an aspect to being integrated in your thinking, your feeling, is to recognize there is an up and a down flow to the energy, you know, and this is very much a part of our breathing. As we inhale, we actually increase our tension, you know, and we tend to come up. And then the exhale allows us to come down. It's a real letdown, okay? Most people in this culture, and certainly my clients, are trapped up.
Right.
They're trapped in their heads.
Surviving by their wits, as your father described. Yeah.
Yeah. And they always are trying to figure things out. Okay. And my clients will, you know, are well familiar with what I say, which is you can't figure this out. You have to feel it.
You got to feel it out. Nice. Right. Absolutely. Okay. I'm with you.
And
but it's a very challenging thing when you've lived in your head, spent a long time detached from your emotional material, from what it feels like to even breathe into your chest, for example. I remember when your dad put me over that stool of his that first time, I thought I was a good breather until that experience. And I'm not a good breather. I mean, it was so tight. And he said, just cry, stimulate crying. And I just couldn't. I didn't have enough air. And so I was living my life. Everybody thought I was the most energized person they knew. But meanwhile, I was completely shallow breathing. And I see how that served the purpose in my childhood. So I didn't have to breathe into the discomfort of my environment. But I also see how it allowed me to survive and build some kind of a life culturally, because surviving by your wits is a more usually economically rewarding survivalist path in the way our culture is designed.
Yeah.
So if you want to come down into this, you're at odds with that way of being in the culture that's rewarded in the culture.
Well,
It's
you have to
complicated.
face the fear. You have to face your
Right,
fear,
right,
because
right,
fear
right.
is what creates that split between the mind and body. We're afraid of these feelings, so we go into our head,
Mhm.
you know, where the feelings are much more limited. And I agree too, out of that quote that you spoke of, that you read, is that our thinking is always a manifestation of our feelings. And I know the
Right,
last,
that's what I was talking about. Right, right,
yes, they are.
right.
Unfortunately, and it's not as though when people are split, mind and body, they don't have feelings.
Mhm.
The problem is those feelings are distortions,
Mhm.
and always a distortion of fear. So, for example, you know, many people have difficulty really being angry in a very straight and real,
Mhm.
appropriate way.
Mhm.
All right.
Mhm. Mhm. It's
You know,
convoluted or passive or something.
well, it can come out as a rage. It can come out as a
Mhm.
road rage, or it can come out
Mhm.
as, you know, we have these incredible problems with random mass shootings.
Mhm. Mhm.
Those are all due to a rage, you
Mhm.
know, even though they're planned out in advance. It's not an impulsive rage. It's a
Mhm.
rage that brews to the point where their thinking is crazy,
Mhm.
and they plot out how they're going to kill as many people as they can kill in a given
Mhm.
circumstance,
Right.
you know. But that's an acting out of anger. It's not
Misplaced
a
aggression.
connection to anger.
Misplaced aggression. Absolutely. Yeah.
Misplaced, acted out, and taken out on a relatively safe object.
Mhm.
Because that's the way the fear works, is that if your
Mhm.
father basically tells you, you know, you be quiet, I don't want to hear your anger, otherwise I'm going to give you something to really cry about.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, that's a fearful threat,
Mhm.
especially coming from a 150, 200-pound man
Mhm.
and a 50-pound child.
Mhm.
Okay.
Right.
So
Right.
you hear that many times, and you're
Mhm.
going to be afraid of your anger.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that that anger energy goes away, you
Right.
know, it just
Mhm.
comes out sideways, or it comes out in a rage, or it comes out inappropriately, you know.
Mhm.
People like Trump are angry all the time,
Mhm.
you know, because he's not really connected the anger at his father.
Right.
Right. But
Yep.
the same thing is true for sadness. You know,
Mhm.
people aren't connected to their sadness.
Yeah.
You know, they may cry over the loss of a pet inconsolably,
Mhm.
but really what that energy is about is the sadness for what's happened to them at the hands of their
Fellow humans.
typically, or
Fellow
fellow
humans.
humans.
Yeah.
But it's really a story of the childhood. You know, it's
Mhm.
the family plays the role of preparing children for the larger culture.
Mhm.
And then the culture continues the same kind of incentives.
Mhm.
You know, it's like
Well said.
you got to do, not be, you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
and you know, maintain control over yourself, because, you know, something terrible is going to happen if you don't. And that's a huge issue with many of my clients, is that, you know, they maintain such a control over their lives and their feelings that it precludes any enjoyment or pleasure,
Mhm.
which is
Well,
really what life is most about.
mhm. Well, when you're rewarded for your achievement and not your presence, you just keep perpetuating the achievement cycle in one form or another.
Right, right. So it's not uncommon for clients to say, what can I do? What can I do?
Mhm.
And really, the only real answer is, if you need to do something, do nothing
Mhm.
and be with yourself.
Mhm.
And that is the hardest thing,
It's like visiting a foreign country.
you know? And also, getting back to the breathing aspect out of that quote, you know, I think it's fair and safe to say that none of us breathe well.
Mhm.
You know, you
Mhm.
talked about your experience, but it's not unique.
Yeah.
You know, I breathe, I think, better because, you know, I've worked on myself for quite a while. I was
Mhm.
lucky to be brought up by my father, who valued these things and encouraged me to be good with my feelings.
Mhm.
Um, but you know, I too, you know, I too don't breathe as well as I know that I could. But I think it's safe to say that none of us breathe well. And again, it's the fear that gets in the way of our breathing.
Yeah.
Because breathing, along with food, is what generates our energy. And energy and feelings are not exactly the same thing, but they're very closely intertwined. And that's, of course, why my father calls this therapy bioenergetics, because it really has to do with the energy of feelings and the energy of living. And because food is not an issue, I mean, not that we're, you know, have the kind of nutrition that we all need, but we have plenty of food. Food is not the limiting factor here. The limiting factor is the air that's required to metabolize that food.
Right? And if you're shallow breathing, you're shallow metabolizing, basically.
You reduce your energy. And you reduce your energy to reduce the intensity of those painful feelings.
Right.
Okay. And that is the function of reducing your breathing.
Shallow the breath, shallow the energy, feel
feeling.
less of the discomfort.
Exactly.
And be more able to convince yourself that everything's all right.
And that's the job of the mind, to be disconnected from the reality of the body.
Right. Well, also, you're not getting information from your embodied experience with the low energy system that there's a whole bunch of unresolved material waiting in the wings for you.
That's right. So typically, especially with narcissists, but generally with people, you know, their self-image is not, in fact, you know, it's not actually a reflection of who they really are. You know, the idea that they have of themselves is really not a true reflection of what's really going on for them. And so that's part of the process of helping to try to heal that disconnect between how people think and how people feel, is to align that self-image with who they really are.
With reality. Right.
Yeah. And so, you know, part of that is, you know, you have to learn what the restrictions to your breathing are. It's, you know, how well we breathe. You would think it would be an important thing in medical profession. But, you know, doctors don't talk about breathing the way we talk about it. You know,
mainstream doctors don't really know a whole lot about these things, I don't think. As a rule.
And that's a whole nother area that would be fascinating.
We can talk. Oh, I could spend forever talking about that. You know, my naturopath talks about breathing. I mean, it's I've never met a medical practitioner other than her and various body-centered, you know, psychotherapists and massage people that ever talk about breathing.
And now breathing too, it's important to understand, because I find a lot of people don't, that it's more, you know, the object is not just to breathe well when you're practicing breathing. Okay. In the therapy work we do, we recognize the breathing as being one of the main ways that, by reducing the breathing, perpetuates the disorder and the anxiety and the stress. All right. And so the real trick is to understand what gets in the way of breathing well 24/7. Not just when you're practicing breathing.
Right.
And the answer to that is fear. You know, so you can spend a half an hour doing yoga or meditation or any one of a number of techniques and breathe well during that period because you're focused on it. But the moment you go outside and get engaged with your life, you go back to your old pattern.
Right. Be habitual.
And that's because those age-old fears continue to affect you in a way that, oh no, you know, I don't want to get angry here. I don't want to accept my sadness. You know?
So let's shallow the breath. I mean, that's an unconscious response, but it's a patterned response. Yeah.
And that's what psychotherapy is, of course, is working with the elements in the unconscious. That's the psycho part of psychotherapy. So we
Yeah.
need to, I find that you need to come to terms with the fears that people have. And again, oftentimes, when we start talking about their fears, they're not even aware that those fears are actually fears.
Mhm.
You
I remember being in your dad's office, and when he put me over that stool that time, I feel like it happened 5 seconds ago. I mean, that was kind of your dad too, and my breath was shallow and was tight. We grounded first. You always grounded first, which was, I understand the importance of that. And then he pushed me. Push, come on, boy. Breathe, cry, whatever your dad gets in your face, the whole thing. And because I had good transference to Jewish grandfather, I didn't whack him. I surrendered and figured he knew what he was doing. But what was interesting is as he kept pushing and I kept pushing, I kind of opened to the next level. And in this place within the lungs itself, I was flooded with a whole series of early childhood uncomfortable memories.
Right.
They were right in my lungs. They were lodged somewhere in the body, and this particular group was right where he was focusing on. He was good at that, I think. And I remember getting off that stool and leaving, taking the train back from New Canaan to Camden to Toronto. And I remember just feeling just startled, Frederic, that I could be living my life consciously with no awareness of just how much unresolved material and as a result, unlived life was living inside of my lungs. Just my lungs. Just one exercise. One lung. Just forget the legs, forget the hips, forget the rest of it. Just right there was a world of material. And I felt as though I thought, in my lifetime, will I ever be able to get to excavate all this material from this crazy early life experience? The answer is no, probably not all of it. But I understood the importance of it because my definition of a life well lived before that experience on your dad's stool was very different from my idea of a life well lived afterwards. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about, is that people, including me, have no idea what we're carrying and the fears that emanate from what we're carrying. And until they have an experience of it, that's why people writing about Trump's psyche, he would see these things running around. It means nothing until you have, on a somatic felt level, this felt experience, an experience of what you and I are talking about. And then you go, oh, I'm not as present as I thought. I'm not even really here. What am I going to do with all this material, this refuse that I'm carrying in my body? And I think the real question is, as I would watch all the sort of hardcore Trumpians, not the day-to-day conservatives, some of those people I agreed with certain things about them, but the hardcore Trumpians, I would look at those people and go, how do we give them an experience of what we're talking about? Because if we don't give them an experience of it, it's utterly meaningless, Well, that's a whole other question. We could spend 2.5 weeks on that. But it has to be experiential. And I think that it has to come through the body somatically. And if the culture keeps us as far removed from our bodies as possible, as a sort of a setup, so we never really know who we are or what we're feeling, why we're choosing what we're choosing or what we're carrying, then they've got us right where they want us. Right?
Exactly.
They've got us right where you need to get over that stool and really feel what you're carrying as part of your re-entry trauma of coming back into the body, clearing the old material so you can know yourself within a body experience, and then reconnect with, or for the first time, connect with your intuitive knowing. For example, my intuitive knowing after leaving your dad's office was always meaningfully different than my intuitive knowing before I walked in a fragmented state. So
yes. Well, in a good therapy session, bioenergetic work, you do get closer to your feelings, and just to comment on the kind of recollections that were coming up, just going over the stool, this is why I say, energy and feelings are closely intertwined. So in body psychotherapy work generally, especially in bioenergetic work, One of the things that I like to do is do some body work early in the session, because that does in fact mobilize both the feelings and intellectual cognitive material that's associated with those feelings. That explains why those recollections come up that had been otherwise, not conscious for such a long time.
Yeah.
And that's how working with the energy is so beneficial in therapy work. I probably said this maybe before, because I like to say it and I say it a lot, is that to do talk therapy only is like trying to walk on one leg. It makes about as much sense.
I mean, it's fine for sense making. It's fine as a preliminary step until you're ready to come home to the body. I mean, your dad would spend 15 minutes talking all the time and would decide when person was comfortable enough to go into the body a little more. I appreciated it because I was a urban head tripper. And I could tell he would talk to me and engage me, and he was smart like you. He could engage, but he's watching the body, waiting for the indication that it's time to open the door. But ultimately, at the end of the day, excessive analysis does perpetuate emotional paralysis. And you go too far in that direction.
If that's the only thing that you got to work with, I mean, it's not uncommon to meet people who've spent as many as 25 years in psychoanalysis. And they understand, right
everything, but their behavior, but their life, nothing but their behavior never changes. I know many people like that.
And their feelings have never changed.
I knew this woman I never met a human being more brilliantly crisp and clarified with respect to naming her stuff. Nothing ever changed in her wild, crazy patterns. Nothing ever changed. And if I think of my little moment with your dad on the stool, which was only one moment like this in my life, in my healing journey, and I think that moment changed something. It made me aware forevermore of how much more there is to heal, and the relationship between healing it and being present for this life. And I think about all of these people out there who've never had the privileged opportunity, because it's not prioritized culturally, to go and do somatic psychotherapist with a master, who will spend their whole lives having absolutely no idea what's living inside of them, or what's organizing their perspective on reality, or why they're making the choices they're making. And it seems to me if our goal was not commodification and not power and not material benefit, but was about having the healthiest humanity possible, some kind of somatic psychotherapeutic process would be part of our life primary school.
Absolutely. This should be the
it should be basic
education. This
should fuck mathematics. I mean, seriously. I mean, how you feel, what you do with your feelings, and how you communicate with other human beings determines most of the quality of your life. And yet there's no devotion to that at all.
It should really be the subject, in my opinion, of physical education from very earliest days. This is what physical education should be about, not being the most competitive sportsman on the field. There's a place for that, but that's not what physical health.
There's a place for that as a part of a pleasure-seeking process.
I mean, and that in itself brings up, I mean, you can have competition is a good thing, but cooperative competition is much, much more effective for everybody concerned than cutthroat competition.
It's more humane.
It's more humane and it's more meaningful all the way around, compared to if I win, you lose, and if you win, it means that I lose. I mean, it's such it's really, again, it's a fear-based way, it's a fear of being a loser. And yet winning and losing are not really natural circumstances. Those are ego circumstances.
They're unhealthily egoic circumstances,
especially when they're driven by fear.
What'll happen to me if I lose? I'll be left behind.
Exactly. I'm afraid to lose. And there's even a saying that says good losers are, how does it go? Let's see. Oh, I can't remember quite. Good losers are losers. I mean, talk about the kind of fear that's associated with winning and losing. But in nature, there's no winning and losing.
Was that a famous Trump quote? That has to be a famous Trump quote.
It would certainly fit. It would, it would.
Well, because he was a bad loser. I mean,
Oh, terrible, terrible. But
um,
not you. He is a loser.
with respect
and we're
to
all losers for the fact that we put him in charge.
absolutely, but he ain't the only one. There's a whole whack of them.
Oh, it's what the culture incentivizes.
Yeah, no, I know.
I mean, and really what we're talking about here is, I think, really at the center of the social dysfunction. A lot of people think that, if we just had better politicians, if we had more education, or if we apply technology to these problems, we can solve all these difficult things. But no, I think what really is the problem is exactly what you and I are talking about, right?
I think you're right. I feel you're right.
Yeah.
I feel you're right.
Yeah, and I'd like to say just a little more, getting back to the breathing thing, is that, most people in this culture don't breathe well, and they're stuck up. Okay, not necessarily stuck up in terms of better than you, but there is a lot of that too. But they're stuck up in their bodies and their heads, and like I was saying earlier, the energy wants to flow up and down. It wants to move. It doesn't want to be stuck. Now, I could say that, anytime you work psychotherapeutically with a client, it's a matter of determining how their energy is stuck. And to help them feel better, which is the goal, you have to unstick the energy. You have to get the energy so that it flows, vibrates, pulsates naturally.
Hence the exercises.
And with the breathing work, what I see so commonly is that people are stuck. They don't breathe well, and they're stuck in their sympathetic autonomic nervous system activation. Sympathetic autonomic nervous system is that fight, flight, freeze response to a threat. And and many of the people I work with and many of the people I see just out and about are literally living as though there's a threat always right around the corner.
And you're saying the staying in the shallow breath way of being perpetuates that state of being.
Yeah, I mean,
even if there is no, in fact, threat, your body's in a state of perceived threat.
Exactly.
Yeah, that feels really right. That feels really right.
And again, it's because the fear in most of this is just plain too large.
Yes, and then they wonder where all the anxiety suddenly came from, and it could be as simple as they're breathing in a way that's perpetuating and reconnecting them to anxiety sources and all the rest of that.
Just like
in their prior history. Yeah, like various stages or levels.
They get to be like that, and they feel like they're suffocating, and they're obviously not breathing. And yet they don't connect to that. And so, breathing well is everybody's best opportunity to find that place to let down, relax, and activate the parasympathetic nervous system.
I think also a strong breathing practice excavates the holdings. I certainly experienced that with holotropic breath work. When I intensified my breath, I was able to get to the material that was held in various parts of the body, similar to your dad's breathing stool. And then the material arose and was at various moments ready to finally be released, so that intensifying the breath reminds me of a different way of being, but it also gives me a better opportunity to clear the emotional debris that's perpetuating my connection to those painful past experiences.
Well, like we were saying earlier, breathing better gives you access to those feelings that you normally push down, push away,
Right, right,
try to rise
right,
above. Okay.
right,
And
right.
by the way, this also has bearing on our social situation economically. You know, economists would never agree with anything I'm about to say. But, this whole idea of, when I was a kid, the richest guy was like, who was he? Howard Hughes. And he was allegedly had a couple of $1 billion, you know. And up until about 5 or 10 years ago, the richest guy was Bill Gates, who had some 50 or 60 billion. And now more recently, we have Elon Musk and the Amazon guy who've hit 200 billion. And of course, they're all racing themselves to be the first trillionaire, But this is such a dysfunctional aspect of how we run our economy, okay? Because again, energetically, it's all going up. It never comes down. It'll come down when it crashes. But, very simply speaking, I'm not a trained economist, but from my understanding of energy, there should literally be a limit and not a spoken limit. It's not as though we should say that, $5 billion is the most that anybody should be allowed to have. But the whole policy should be structured in such a way just opposite of what it is now. Okay, what it is now, it was interesting, somebody asked the Virgin Atlantic guy, what's his name? Can't remember.
Branson or something like
Yeah,
that?
yeah, Richard Branson. They asked him, I heard this interview about 20 years ago, maybe 30, and he was only worth about $5 billion then. And they asked him, they said, was it hard to be a billionaire? And he said, well, yeah, earning the first billion was hard. That was hard. But you almost have to be irresponsible not to earn the second billion.
Okay.
All right.
Right.
And another guy, the Oracle guy, and again, I'm going to forget his name, but the guy who created Oracle, I heard an interview with him when he was worth about $17 billion. And he basically said, you can't spend $17 billion. I know, because I've tried. Right. And so my point here is that, our crazy economic system that creates so much stress all over the world, but even our most wealthy country, the United States, is geared so that the more money you have, the easier it is to make money.
Yeah.
It should be exactly the reverse. The more money you have, each marginal dollar extra should be more and more difficult to earn.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Through taxes or whatever. That's what's healthy. Okay, this other thing is very dysfunctional, because it creates the more money the richest guy makes, okay, the more inequality there is in the whole system.
Yeah,
it just
absolutely. And I come back to really what I feel like is the theme of our conversation with respect to all of that, which is that the more deeply you live inside of a presence-centered body, the less interested you are in, say, substitute gratifications.
Absolutely. Substitute gratification.
Politically, economically, religiously, spiritually, all of that, because you're not living in a frightened, overcompensatory state. You're feeling just gratified, breathing, and happy to be alive.
You don't need that much.
Happy to be alive.
Happy
to be alive.
I
mean, if you had to choose, you ask almost any sensible person this, you had to choose between being satisfied in your body and in your relational life, really deeply gratified, or ungratified, but have $20 billion, which would you pick?
Yeah.
Most relatively healthy people would pick the first option, but so maybe that's the giveaway question. And if people are running for office and they pick door number 2, we don't allow them to run for office.
Very simply, would you rather be rich or happy?
Very simply. Let's leave it there, Frederic. Fantastic. We covered a lot of ground today.
There's so much to be said about this.
And
You know,
we could just book 18 hours, 20 hours, you and I, and just keep talking, you know. No one will listen to it, but we'll enjoy ourselves.
it's you know, it's a very different way of looking at the world.
It is, but it feels like it's our only hope. And I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that this is our only hope.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, what I like to think I'm bringing into it is an integrated an awareness of the mind-body disconnect.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, if you look at the world from that perspective, it's so much different than if you look at the world from the ungrounded, disconnected, ideological sort of shoulds and shouldn'ts of the culture as it is, you know.
The outgrowth of a fragmented consciousness.
And the last thing I'd like to say before we really leave it is that, you know, fear is the problem. Fear is most fundamentally the problem. And a big part of that problem is that we're not aware of our own fears. It's one of those feelings that we're not aware of, you know, just like the hurts and the anger that many of us don't feel just because we pushed it down. Fear plays a tremendous role in how we think and how we behave and decisions we make. And oftentimes I would say that, you know, those decisions and activities are done pushed by fear without any awareness that there's fear involved.
And I think what you're saying,
That's
the disconnect. And I think that what you're saying is that in order to reach the stage where you can live a more fearless life, you first have to make a leap of faith and encounter the fear that stands in the way.
Yeah.
You got to cozy up to your fear and get comfortable enough and clear some of it before you can live a more fearless life.
If you're not connected with your fears bully you.
Yeah.
And the way to deal with those fears is to get real familiar with them and make them your friend. That's the process of the therapy, the way I practice it.
Because if you're not really in touch with your fear, you're not really here.
You're not really present, you know, and presence is also, I think, a real good indicator of health.
I think so too. I think so too. I mean, if we're incarnated, we may as well be here for all of it. Maybe. I'm just, you know, just a crazy idea I had one day. I don't, you know. Thanks, Fred. So
thank you.
Yeah, so they can find you and your work at lowenfoundation.org. You're working with people. There's all your dad's books are there and purchasable off the website. Other resources and all kinds of other links and things. And I checked.
Lowenfoundation.org is our web address. I think we have a nice informative website. It is the web address for the foundation, the Alexander Lowen Foundation.
It's all there. Yeah, the site, I love the site. I checked the site out today. I think I really love the site a lot. Yeah. And we'll talk again soon.
I'd look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah.